Okay, welcome to our last session today, which is about early poetry. I'm replacing Deborah Guerra, who fell ill, as the chair of this session. Our first speaker is Deborah Beck, who is Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Texas at Austin. Her main research interest is expressivity in classical epic poetry. She is the author of 2 books on Homeric speech, Homeric Conversation, published by Harvard University Press in 2005, and Speech Presentation in Homeric Epic, published by University of Texas Austin Press at 2012. She's now finishing a book on similes in Homer, Apollonius, Virgil, and Ovid, which is under contract with the Cambridge University Press. She hosted Orality in Literacy 13, and I was honored to be there, in Austin in 2019, whose proceedings will be published later this year by Brill under the title Repetition, Communication, and Meaning in the Ancient World. Her paper today, Sappho, Lyric and Biography, Textuality as a Mode of Thought, takes her interest in the expressive qualities of early Greek poetry in a new direction. Deborah, please.
Well, I'm very sorry that Deborah Guerra couldn't make it today. On the other hand, it's a great pleasure to share the stage with Rachel, since it is very literally true that I would not be here if it weren't for the epic, heroic, nonstop efforts of not only Rachel, but also Donna and Marguerite. I'd also like to thank my fellow panelist, Andrea, for hospitality, going above and beyond the call of duty that made the slightly awkward first days of our stay while we were in quarantine even more comfortable. So thank you, everyone, for being such great hosts. Our papers so far have focused, as it were, the camera lens of scholarship outwards on ancient texts as the locus of textualization. I want to, as it were, turn that flip switch on my cell phone and take a selfie, a scholarly selfie, in which we ourselves are the people doing the textualizing and not the ancient authors. So I want to shine a spotlight on our own discourse, in part by stepping outside of our habitual modes of analysis in order to treat those modes of thought as a subject of inquiry in their own right. In addition, this is the very first time I have ever spoken in public at all on this new area of scholarship, so I'm still in the early stages of working out what my project even is, let alone what my contribution is going to be. And so I'm very grateful to Niall Slater, not only for delivering a terrific keynote address, but also for making it fine to say, this is a lot of cool things, rather than a fantastically triumphant conclusion at the end. So thank you very much again, Niall. I want to start with a guided tour through the relevant parts of the scholarly landscape in classics, in Greek lyric poetry in general, and in Sappho in particular. Then we'll visit together the recently published Brothers poem of Sappho, which is the subject of the Birrell and Obink 2016 volume on your handout. Now, classicists know there is a list of serious ethical problems from here to the back of the auditorium with this papyrus and with Derek Obink in particular. I elected to talk about the poem anyway because it provides such a useful way to focus our ideas about what current research in Greek lyric is interested in. I seriously considered bailing on it anyway because I'm so bothered by these ethical problems, and that's why I didn't. What we'll come away with today, I hope, is a way of looking at the poem that can stand on its own as a response to the poem itself. What kinds of things do we see when we just let go of everything that isn't the poem itself? So starting with the scholarly landscape and classics in general, there's been a turn over the last 10 to 15 years towards embodied cognition, towards thinking about the physical and perceptual experience of poetry, of narrative, of literature. A recent contribution to this that's accessible from a wide range of particular fields is my next volume on classics in cognitive theory. Some of our conference participants have written papers in this volume, and therefore the quality of the volume speaks for itself. The contribution on Sappho is entitled Sappho and the Kinesthetic Turn, Agency and Embodiment in Archaic Greek Poetry. Now, paradoxically, this paper talks about embodiment and kinesthetics in a very disembodied way. This is a highly theorized description of a physical experience that in no way approximates or facilitates readers having or entering that experience for themselves. In lyric studies in particular, that general turn toward individual experience and subjectivity takes the form of moving away from the performance context and anthropological modes of analysis that have held sway in lyric studies for the last several decades. Now, this is a new enough development that it's far from clear what's going to take its place, but contributors to the 2018 essay collection entitled Textual Events were asked to each propose some forms of critical distance from what the editors call the anthropological paradigm. That's a quotation from the paper of Mark Payne. Coming to a somewhat comparable conclusion, David Fern's 2020 survey, sort of a monograph-length review article about bibliography in Greek lyric, which begins with a very detailed case study of Sappho and looking at several different kinds of approaches to Sappho over the decades. He finishes that survey by saying, and this is a quotation from page 23, a more successful strategies than these other things he's just been talking about might be to return to the surface of the poems despite the complexity of the language and imagery, rather than aiming to get at the putative settings behind them. Ruth Scodell's keynote address from the last Orality and Literacy in 2019 pointed out that if we assume some form of textualized reperformance, which was her basic thesis, that there's so much Greek literature that there's just not enough festivals at which all of those things could be reperformed. And so in order to understand the continuity and the survival of Greek literature from a quite early period, we have to take writing into consideration. I think one implication of that idea is that the poem has to be at least somewhat self-contained, because otherwise the people coming to it later are just going to be lost. The audience has to be able to at least somewhat understand their own role simply by reading the poem. So to sort of summarize what all of these people are trying to get at from different directions, the surface of the poem that Fern talks about is the only thing we know that any audience had access to at any time. That surface is what binds us to everyone else who's read the poem from when it was first performed, whatever that means, until now. I think this is to some extent a comprehensive turn in lyric poetry studies in general, not just in Greek lyric, thinking in particular about the work of Jonathan Culler in his 2015 survey of lyric, including Greek and Roman lyric, but going all the way up to the present day. He starts his book by pointing out that creating new interpretations as the goal, if you will, the telos of studying lyric, reading lyric poetry is a new, I think he thinks it's kind of a weird thing to do. So he's clearly interested in a kind of shift of focus also in reimagining our understanding of what we're doing there when we're reading Greek lyric. I want to now turn towards the personal and subjective a little bit by talking about my entry into this material. How did I get to this from working on subjectivity and expressivity in classical epic? I think my current work on similes is grappling over and over again with some aspects of how to talk about the experience of the universal timeless presentness of an epic simile. And that problem and also that experience of a simile, I think, has a lot in common with the timeless presentness that combines specificity and sort of universality that we find in Greek lyric and in lyric in general. So my own recent scholarly writing has had a lot of it is simply how to capture the nonverbal dimensions of a verbal phenomenon, which in my current work is epic similes, but I'm now going to ask that basically the same question, only talking about Sappho and about Greek lyric. How do we describe a nonverbal experience? Or how do we describe an absence or a gap, which is so fundamental to the reader's experience of both epic similes and lyric poetry? So someone trying to do this in an effective and engaging way, me, will not find a lot of help or guidance or examples in recent scholarship, despite its focus on individual experience and subjectivity. How do we create these experiences? Instead of treating a poem like a butterfly in the study of a 19th century botanist that we pin down carefully inside a glass case and label it with a neatly written Latin name and think we've done the butterfly justice, when what we've really done is textualized a nonverbal phenomenon. So moving my sort of camera to a slightly different direction, how do we leverage that self-contained aspect of lyric poetry to make ancient lyric inviting and accessible to non-specialist and student readers? Not simply how do we capture the experience of the poetry better, but how do we make that possible for more different kinds of readers? Particularly for Sappho, whose life story has made her a uniquely appealing figure for basically all of literary history. Where is the discourse for dilettantes in the original sense of that word? People who love the poems, but are not professionals or specialists. Is there a way to narrow the chasm that has grown up between dilettantes and professionals? To put the same thing another way, is there a way to write about issues of scholarly interest in a way that non-scholars can understand and enjoy? Spoiler alert, I don't know, but I think we need to try. I want to start turning towards actually Sappho with a quotation from Anne Carson, whose lively and direct writing style in her essay Eros the Bittersweet gives the reader a real sense of what it feels like to read Sappho. So for example, on page 26, she says, Sappho reconstructs the space of desire in a poem that is like a small, perfect photograph of the erotic dilemma. I think the sort of through line, one of the main ideas that runs throughout Carson's essay is the idea of eros as an absence, a yearning for something not present. And ideally, our scholarship, too, should arouse eros, or at any rate, pleasure in readers, especially, but not exclusively, when we are writing about eros. To ask the same question in a somewhat different way, how do we write about the presence of an absence? So now I want to read aloud to you the translation of the Brothers' song. The words that are underlined or have boxes around them will come back in the close reading of the poem that I'm going to do in the last part of my paper. But first, it would be good for us to all know what the poem says. So the first stanza is missing, and let me just say before I start that when I talk about specific line numbers, I'm going to be using the ones the furthest to the left that are not in parentheses, the higher numbers. So there's a stanza that's missing, and then we have, but you are always chattering for Caraxes to come with a full ship. Zeus and all the other gods know these things, I think, but it is not necessary for you to think these things. Summon me instead, and commission me to beseech Queen Hera over and over again, that Caraxes may arrive, piloting back here a ship that is safe, and find us safe and sound. Let us entrust all other things to the gods, for out of huge gales fair weather swiftly ensues. All of those whom the king of Olympus wishes a divinity as helper to now turn them from troubles, become happy and richly blessed. Now there's a box around mess because I think Obink totally messed this up, and I'll come back to that later. And if Laricus lifts up his head, if only he might one day be an established man, become a man, is what the Greek actually says. The deep and dreary draggings of our soul we'd swiftly lift to joy. And then I have another grumpy thing about Euthamen, sorry. Okay, so before I say what I want to say about this poem, I want to briefly contextualize what I'm going to do in relation to what other people have done. And I don't have a gigantic long bibliography in the spirit of this talk, which is I'm trying to get out from underneath the kind of tyranny of scholarly discourse, and I want to focus just on the things I actually want to say. And so I only have one article on here that's a current article about specifically the Brothers poem, but it's a very recent one. It's forthcoming. It's not even out yet, that has in it all the other bibliography that a person might want to look at. It's also a great paper. If it wasn't good, I wouldn't have put it in there. Schultz's 2021 forthcoming article is the winner of the Winkler Prize, which is an annual award for an undergraduate or graduate student who writes the best paper on a risky or marginalized area of classics. So the various things people have talked about in relation to this poem, mostly within this performance context kind of paradigm. And this is what I'm choosing to call textualizing the poem, wanting to pin it down, wanting to describe its location precisely, rather than capture it as an experience. So, a very popular question, who is the you that Sappho is talking to? Spoiler alert, there's no way to know, and I'm not going to talk about that exactly, even though my focus is going to a lot be on the people in the poem. I'm interested in their emotional relationship and not their identity. The names and the brothers mentioned in the poems in relation both to other references to Sappho and her brothers in other writers, and also the brothers motif in other early Greek poetry. People are interested in the real-life religious practices that underline the reference to praying to Hera, various other things. So I want to focus on the people, the characters in the poem. For most people, that's the most kind of prominent part of the poem, and I think it's also, as I'm going to suggest, clearly sort of the organizational principle of the poem. Not who the people are, but what's their relationship to each other. So the first half of the poem focuses on you and I. So the first surviving stanza, the word in the middle of it is chattering. You chatter is a second person singular verb form. And then there's that first person singular verb form in line 6, I think. Then we have again in the lines immediately after that pronouns, the second person pronoun se in line 7, and the first person pronoun emme in line 9. So in addition to this kind of connection and parallelism between the I and the you from these words, there's also a connection created by the verb forms. So when we see at the end of line 9 that you is going to, kelesthai is going to order the first person singular what to do, that establishes some kind of relationship, but that's actually not as helpful as we might like, because the Probert article is on your handout because it explains, even though it says it's about the Hecuba specifically, it's actually saying that Greeks were much more willing to use imperatives in a much wider range of contexts than modern speakers tend to be. And so if you say to somebody, order me to do da-da-da, that doesn't give you the same clarity of social or power relationships as you might expect it to if you're using a modern framework as your reference point. What we know about these people in the first two stanzas is they have a connection to each other because they both care about Caraxes, but as Schultz points out in her article, he's not the focus. They never talk to him. They're talking about him. His main importance is in relation to these people who care about his well-being. Now, the second half of the poem, that is to say, the last three stanzas, which if the first stanza were still here, would be the second half of the poem, is structured around we. This is the key character for the second half of the poem, but it's not one that's gotten the same amount of attention as the I and the you in the first half, even though I think once you see that the poem really falls into these two halves of the you and I first half and the we second half, it suddenly seems like, why has nobody talked about this? I think in some sense, we is an even more interesting character from a deictic perspective than you, because we is a more slippery word from a deictic point of view. It could include that you, who's addressed by the speaking I in the first half, or not. We just don't know. Does it include us, the readers? It certainly offers us an invitation to consider us part of that we. It's important to note here that the lack of clarity about who the we is not because the poem is fragmentary or because we don't know anything about the performance context. It's because of the deixis of we. This is built into the Greek. And the structure of the poem itself marks us as important. So the first person plural pronoun ames appears first in the third stanza there in line 13, and in the last stanza in line 21. That's why there's a box around the second ames, because Obink just doesn't translate that at all. You wouldn't be able to tell from his translation that there is a we in the first line of the poem, even though I think it has an important structural role in shaping this part of the poem. So you can see from Obink's translation that at least he has missed the point of that particular aspect of the poem. In addition, I think we are sort of doing various different kinds of things over the course of that second half of the poem. We're doing things that combine being active and being passive, in the sense that in that hortatory subjunctive, epitropomen, let's turn things over, we're taking charge together. We're kind of linking arms and saying, yay, let's do this thing. But what we're actually doing is giving someone else the job of taking care of the situation that we're concerned about. The very last word of the poem, luthamen, we might be freed, is, again, we're the subject grammatically, but someone else is doing the work, and we don't know who. We don't know who is freeing us from the heavy-heartedness that we're going to be freed from. Is it Laricus becoming a man? Is it something else? We don't know. So this we is combining being active and being acted upon by the things that are happening in a way that can't really be distinguished. And I have a box around luthamen because Obink translated that actively, which irritated me. Okay, so I think I've talked about the I and you in the first half and the we separately, but they have clearly a lot in common, aside from the likely possibility that the we includes both the I and the you. So as with this you in the earlier stanzas, the uncertainty draws us to this we, even as we can never close the distance between ourselves and them. We feel desire for them, in part because they are absent. We desire to know who they are, to understand their feelings, and to enter into their story. Whatever else we do not know, we know that this is a group of people in addition to or alongside the speaker who together care about the same things. So where does this leave us? Whoever these people are, and neither the I or the you is named, we know that they care about one another, that they have a close relationship, and that they are united in their concern for Caraxes and Laricus. We know that Caraxes, at least, cares about them too, because otherwise, when it says in line 13, I hope he finds us safe and sound, if Laricus doesn't, Caraxes doesn't actually care if they're safe and sound, that's kind of a weird thing to say. They care about their relationships with the gods, and they have some expectation that at least some of the time the gods are interested in them as well, or at any rate that the gods are aware of them and of their concerns. So to sum up, there's quite a lot we don't know here. There's a lot that we do know about who these people are because we know about what they care about and what that feels like. I think that's enough if we can find the right way to say that. And I will freely admit I have not yet found that way, but I'm going to keep looking, and I hope that you will help me to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Any questions or comments? I see there are maybe some written ones. I'm not sure that they are for this session. Yeah. Two from Atenodora. would the addition of these lines about the creation of the iron, no, it belongs to Ruth paper. I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Any questions? Okay, so thank you very much. You wanted to say something? No, Dana? No? Okay. Ruth? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I just want to say you're obviously totally right about comments at the end, which surely is very strong because it's picking up, Kenoi, Makarez, Pelontai, those people. We also, I mean, that is, it's not only Amez he didn't translate, it's Kai.
Yeah, no, he just totally blew it there. I mean, that's clearly, that's clearly the end of the poem, taking these really sort of summarizing, synthesizing gesture towards the rest of it.
On the other hand, I think the syntax is pretty clear that while you may not have an agent for that final infinitive, you have a sufficient condition. If Larikos achieves this situation, we would ipsa instantaneously.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I wasn't thinking about the ipsa. I wasn't interested so much really as much in who the agent is as just in that sort of, again, combination of being passive and being active at the same time.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you. I appreciate that correction. This, as you can see, one of the ways in which this is a preliminary effort is that those of you who've ever heard me give a paper before, this is about 1/4 the amount of close reading that I normally do, because at this point I'm more interested in kind of setting parameters as a kind of proof of and then a little bit of Greek as a kind of proof of concept. But once I get more comfortable with what the heck am I actually doing here, yes, there's going to be a lot more. There's going to be a lot more Greek, and I'll be sort of diving more deeply into more of the details.
Well, yeah, one thing I think you can play with is that you can almost read this poem as about what kind of active you should be in order to be passive.
Oh, what a fun way to put it.
Because, pray, and having done that, you don't do anything else.
Yes. Well, and I think that's a way of, that's a really common way of talking about an important theme in so much poetry, is not to say, here's the thing, people, but to create a collision between two opposites, between active and passive, as a way to say the theme of the poem is personal agency. And the way I'm going to say that is to crash together two opposite ways of thinking about human agency.
I don't have anything meaningful to add, except I would like to throw in, if you're looking for comparative or other passages, of course, jumps to mind is from the Prometheus Bound, Prometheus and the way he uses ego, the way he spreads it through that monologue. It's not the same project. It's not the same thing going on, but it's the same. It would be maybe compare or contrast how is he being active, being the protos herotes? How is he playing around with the pronouns and with the persons? Maybe finding patterns, even for different projects, you would say, maybe will helpful. I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you. I've written it down.
Thank you. I didn't think of that until you explained this. So.